Welcome to today's workshop on leading and managing the transition to net zero. I'm Emily Stubbs, Policy and Projects Manager at the Chamber, and today's webinar is all about the tools for affecting change within your business and how organisations are approaching the transition to net zero. This event is part of our Growth Through People campaign, which is all about boosting productivity through improved leadership and people management capabilities. And it takes place throughout March with 8 free events and webinars and a full-day conference on the 30th of March, which I highly encourage you to join us for. We've got lots of inspirational keynotes, thought-provoking panel discussions, and breakout workshops. I'd like to thank all of our headlines partners and sponsors for their support: Aston University, Birmingham City Council, South City College Birmingham, and the West Midlands Combined Authority. And I'd also like to give a huge thank you to our speakers today for giving up their time and agreeing to share some of their expertise. So we've got Will Hargreaves, who's the Environmental Policy Advisor at Chamber of Commerce. He'll be setting the scene on the transition to net zero. Rob McCracken, Head of Transformational Change at Curium Solutions, will be talking us through some of the tools for leading and managing change. And Luke Strickland, who is Net Zero Advisory Lead for Buildings and Cities at McDonalds, will be giving a bit of a case study on leading and managing the transition to net zero. I'll mention it now, but I'll also mention it at the end of today's session. If you could spare 5 minutes to complete our post-event survey, it would be hugely appreciated. It's not just about event feedback, or webinar feedback in this case. It will contribute to our research into leadership and people management in the region, our policy work with local and national stakeholders on this agenda, and inform what Growth Through People looks like in future years. Please do, if you're on social media, join us using the hashtag GTP22. And I hope you enjoy the session and take away something to implement within your own business to affect positive change. And without further ado, I will now hand over to Will to set the scene on the transition to net zero. Over to you, Will.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so I'm the Environmental Policy Lead at the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. And as Emily said, I'm just going to set a bit of the context today on net zero. Next slide, please. So some of you may have seen these. These are the climate stripes, and what you're seeing here is blue representing a cooler climate and the red stripes representing a warmer climate. And you can really see at the top of that, those red stripes intensifying it in colour. And this is, as many of you will know, as a result of increased greenhouse gas emissions, which trap heat in our atmosphere as a result of, modern energy use or modern way of doing things. And what this is doing is causing, a huge amount of disruption to economies and does, result in some really extreme weather. So we've seen disruption to supply chains through different storms that we've had. Most recently Storm Eunice, but also looking at the kind of heat impacts from that. So we're seeing commodities being limited in supply because of changing climate circumstances. And all of these are leading to millions, if not billions, of cost damages to economies. There's also health impacts as well. With increased climate and a hotter climate, we will see more heat waves, and unfortunately, that does impact the most vulnerable in the society. But we have seen quite a lot of progress from the UK government and from businesses who are really positively responding to the requirement really to tackle this global issue. Next slide, please. So building on that point, I just wanted to give an overview of policy. See, with the science, it is pretty clear. 99% of scientists have consensus that this is a very large issue, and as a result of that, we're seeing policies regionally. So the Combined Authority have targeted net zero by 2041, And as part of that, they actually want to decarbonise the West Midlands Combined Authority area by 25% by 2026. And then nationally, we have a net zero target of 2050. That is a legislated target. And we're actually seeing some interim targets as a result of that. So one of which being a 78% reduction in CO2 equivalent emissions by 2035 based on 1990 levels. And internationally, as many of you will be aware, we hosted COP in November last year, where we essentially managed to agree some international principles and actions to help tackle this issue. Some of the biggest being are around deforestation, methane, coal phase outs, and zero emission cars as well. These policies are really driving change within the industry. We're seeing quite a lot of businesses taking lead, announcing their own net zero targets, putting in stipulations to their contracts when they're working with other suppliers and businesses to have net zero strategies or be reducing their emissions. But we're also seeing some other policy changes as well. So all new road vehicles will be zero tailpipe within the next 20 years. We're also seeing the phase out of fossil fuel boilers, and there'll be no new or replacement installations in 2035, and really kind of looking at the move towards heat pumps, hydrogen and district heat networks. Could you have the next slide, please? So I just wanted to highlight a bit of our research and support that we have available for businesses as well. So our role is to really research and inform and engage businesses on net zero and environmental trends. And as part of this, we have surveyed businesses. We found that the positive news is that most businesses are taking measures to reduce their environmental impact, as you can see on the left there. But also, crucially, a lot of businesses are intending to increase future environmental measures as well. Getting to net zero is going to be a huge challenge for individuals and businesses, and we are seeing some of the main barriers being lack of time, lack of grant funding, but also unsure of the options available. And how the Chamber has set to support this is by, you'll see on the bottom left there, providing a low carbon support grid, which details all of the regional and national support and funding that's available for your business. But also, as I'll mention, talking through running key campaigns such as the Sustainable Business Series to help plug that knowledge gap. Next slide, please. So the Sustainable Business Series was a flagship campaign for the Chamber. It was the first sustainability campaign, and we ran it in partnership with Coventry and Warwickshire Chamber of Commerce. And really the aim of this was to support business progress to net zero. You can find all of the detail on our website. We covered 5 themed weeks. So we had an SME webinar, but then also we had energy, waste and resources, circular economy and business management. So if you are interested and you're looking to really progress your business to net zero, there's plenty of content there to support. And there's just some of the feedback from delegates that we surveyed there. So really positive impact. Next slide, please, Em. So that's it for me, short and sweet. But if you do have any questions, then my contact details are there. If you want to discuss any of the topics or issues that are going on at the moment for businesses and how it's best to support them, please do contact me. But yeah, thank you all for attending today, and we'll have questions at the end. I think that's over to you, Rob.
Fantastic, thanks ever so much, Will. As Will has said, over to you, Rob, to talk about some of the tools for affecting change within your business.
Hi everybody, I'm Rob McCracken. I'm a programme, project and change professional who's worked with Curium Solutions for about the last 7 years now. Before that, I worked in utilities and retail as well, so I have a bit of experience in some of the challenges we're facing here today. Typically, I play a role within as a business implementation partner for large-scale technology delivery. And basically, my role is to make sure that we deliver the benefits for our customers through a people-first approach to delivering the change. Now, you're probably thinking, well, what does people first actually mean? Well, it does exactly what it says on the tin. We work through the change and how it will impact upon our key stakeholders and bring them on the journey as our first thought, not an afterthought. And what we tend to find is in doing so, you get far more out of your investment. After all, there's no point in us spending millions of pounds on a new piece of kit for it to sit in the corner, a bit like my golf clubs in the garage. So this 20 minutes isn't intended to be a silver bullet for people change through net zero. I'd be a narcissist if I thought I could provide that to you guys in this session. But hopefully it gives you some food for thought and provides an additional perspective on the challenges that we collectively face in meeting net zero. So to begin, I'm going to start with an existential question. Easy for me to say. Why do we do what we do? Now, you may answer, for the rebels amongst us, it's because I make my own choices. I always do what I want. Or for the conscientious amongst us, it might be our moral compass and we do what's right. For the annoying self-centered guy in the room, it might be just the self-interest and doing what's best for him. And all of those things have an element of truth within them, but they're all quite surface level, quite superficial answers. It goes deeper than that. Underneath those answers, what is driving the behavior? But rather than me just providing, I go back a slide, rather than me providing the perspective for you, I'm interested in your thoughts. So in the chat, would it be okay for you to add in what you think drives your behavior? And you might have saw some of my thoughts in the slide a second ago. So if you could add some thoughts, guys, for the next minute or so in the chat, that'd be great. This is where I see that no one's paying attention and don't want to add anything. Hello, Jeff, from Car Charging. Yep, completely agree, Monica. Definitely, Richard, definitely in this space for sure. Yep, completely agree. Any other thoughts, guys? Absolutely. Emily, are you okay to head on to the next slide? So I completely agree. My CEO says so. Unfortunately, there is a bit of that as well, Richard. You're right. As you can see, I completely agree with the vast majority of what you guys have said there. And there are a lot of things that do drive what we do on a daily basis. So if I go through some of these examples and talk about myself, history and background, I'm from a working class background myself, and it was drilled into me by my mum and dad that nothing comes for free, that hard work is a must. From a values perspective, got a dad who's a strong, although quiet, religious faith that undoubtedly has influenced me through my life so far. I do what's easy. Although I like working hard as a must, I don't want to work any harder than I need to. It's sometimes expected of me. So as a father, as a son, as an uncle, as a friend, I'm influenced by what I think people want me to do. Social norms. We only just need to look at what's happened in the last 2 years with COVID and the seismic change of what's acceptable or not. Handshakes are now fist pumps, quite like that actually. But there's all those things that are different and also learned behavior. I've been relatively successful in my work to this point with hard work, so I get rewarded for that. What's my mentality going to be? Well, I'm going to continue to work harder. But what do all of these things have in common? They're really hard to change. And to achieve our aspirations for net zero, we're going to have to challenge and shape some of these things. So today, I'm going to borrow from a couple of guys called Chip and Dan Heath and use their metaphor of the elephant and the rider. And we'll find that this metaphor is a really nice way of making the psychology of behavioural change and the brain much more relatable. Thanks, Emily. So there are two systems in our brain, the rational and the emotional. And this is where the metaphor of the elephant and the rider comes in. So think of your rational system as the rider. And that's the part of your brain that plans, deals in logic, solves problems, on top of an emotional elephant. Now, the rider, after analysing the options ahead, may decide, I want to head north, because that's the right and the logical thing to do. But what if the elephant that represents our emotional system and provides the power for the journey ahead doesn't agree? Well, the rider may try to coax it, may try to push it, pull it to make it go north, but who do you think is going to win more often than not? Well, that's right, the elephant. It's a massive weight advantage after all. What the 5-6 tons compared to mine, slightly more than I'd want it to be. It's a massive imbalance. And it's that imbalance that makes behavioural change really difficult. The key is to get them heading in the same direction. Even when you've done that though, and we're working together, our dynamic duo or both want to head north, you also need to consider the path. Emily, could you click on the 3 bits? Thank you. The path represents external factors that influence our duo. So when you talked about government, local authority, absolutely they've got a role to play. If we can make their path easier and shorter, they're more likely to get where we want them to be. Removing blockers and reducing the change should make that happen. So that brings us to our situation today. Logically, we know as a rider that net zero isn't just the right thing to do, but it's critical to our survival as a human race. But we still aren't quite getting there, right? My assumption is that in part that may be caused by the elephant not pointing in the same direction or emotions not being tied to it, as well as the path being a little bit harder than it needs to be. So we're going to look at how we can use this metaphor and apply it to what we're looking at today with net zero. Next slide, please. So as I said, the rider represents our rational system. To appeal to it, we use clarity and logic. Now, naturally, we'll jump into clarity and logic being plans, analysis, data, working out the solution that we're going to deploy. However, we often don't think about a vision of the future, the outcomes that we want to achieve from delivering the things we're going to do. We know the target we need to get to, but we don't necessarily colour in the detail about the things that need to be true for us to achieve those targets. So taking a step back and thinking not just about what we will deliver, but what we are needing to do to bring that change around is quite key. We call this, or I call this within Curium, mapping the change. And typically we tend to think of a one-to-one straight line cause and effect. If I do X, I will get Y. But often it's not quite as simple as that. So for example, if I said I want to be healthier, you might jump in straight away and say, eat less, Rob, or eat more veg, maybe do some exercise. All of those things might be true. You might even go beyond the one-to-one cause and effect and say, if you're really serious about it, Rob, you need to do all 3. But what difference would it make if you paused? And rather than jumping and saying, this is what you should do, you ask the question of, tell me more about what healthier means to you. What is it you want to work on? And in doing so, I might share that I want to be able to run a marathon. I want to stop smoking. I want to work on my resilience and mental health. All of those things completely different from what the worker would do and from what you just previously suggested. Depends on what my vision of healthier is. You'd likely to advise on different actions. So that's the point. By exploring your vision of what you're looking to achieve with your part of making net zero happen, you can start to articulate what you want people to do differently, what you want to see more of or less of. The main difference between my example and net zero is there's significantly more opinions you need to gain than just mine. You need to explore it with your relevant teams and align around it. You won't align to begin with, guys, I can pretty much guarantee. But once you've gone through that process, it'll provide you a much richer picture of the change you're looking to bring around. And when you can fully describe that picture, you can think then about what activities and plans and actions you need to put in place to make that your new reality. So through mapping the change, you should hopefully have some clarity of vision and outcomes. You'll be one more step closer to bringing about net zero for your business. So that's the first bit about the rider and the logical side of the system that you've got. The second part of the analogy, thanks Emily, is the elephant, who represents an emotional system. So to appeal to the elephant, we need to talk and motivate with emotion to emotion. However, unfortunately, studies show that our vocabulary around emotion is pretty bleak, which often encourages us to talk and appeal through fear and the negative. And I think that's quite relatable when you think of net zero and you look at the literature and messaging out there on why we need to change and target it is equally bleak. And whilst negative emotions can drive behavioural change, it's typically short term. It's typically less sustainable. As soon as the external force that's causing it is removed, or perhaps dulled over time as you get used to it, the driver for the change becomes less effective and revert to the status quo. You only need to think about what happened at the beginning of COVID through to the second and third lockdowns. You can see how that transpired. So positive emotion tends to have a much longer lasting effect on change. So the question is, how do we positively motivate the elephant in the room? And what we find here at Curium is that storytelling is a really powerful way of forming those connections with your team and bringing them on the journey. It helps them to make sense of what needs to happen, how they can play a positive part within it, often making them the hero of the story, not us, and it can help break down the change into smaller, much more manageable chunks. Ultimately, we're trying to shrink the change and make it far less daunting. It really is our most powerful tool as a race in conveying complex messages in a memorable and engaging way. So if you think of Avengers Endgame, if you like the movies, and you asked of us to ask you to give me all the facts of all the plots of the 23 films that led up to that point and how everything's interconnected, good luck. Your mind would be blown. I'd struggle with it, and I'm a comic book geek. But if you strip it right back to a story about how one guy wants to create a more sustainable future, definitely in the wrong way, guys, not the way to achieve net zero, and how a universe of people band together through their pain and differences to stop them, it's far more relatable. We become invested, perhaps too invested if you ask my wife Sarah. It was dusty in the cinema, okay? But the point is that stories create connections. They tug at our emotions in a way that facts never can. We can see ourselves in them. We can make ourselves those heroes, and we can use them to help to navigate through our current circumstances. So where could you start? Well, step one to any storytelling is to do something that, again, Marvel are great at. Know your audiences. Be clear who they are. What are they worried about? What motivates them? And then target that with a compelling story. Now, if you can get every single person in your business fired up for net zero, that's amazing. Please tell me how you've done it. But for some, you just need to start reducing the resistance. And how could you do that? Make sure they're represented in your story. Make them the hero of it. Listen to their concerns, build their representation into your stories, and help them see and connect with what net zero means for them. In doing so, you might go some way to reducing the fear and uncertainty that might be driving their resistance. So we've covered the rider and the elephant so far. The final part is the path. And the path represents the journey, thanks Emily, that we'll be going on to change. Now the knack is to make this part of the journey as easy as possible to adopt the new behaviour and as hard as possible to slide back into the bad old habits. Now we all know that emotional elephants can be spooked easily, right? And that's a problem when they are so big and they have such a sway over our behaviour and ultimately the decisions and actions we take. Resistant emotions are typically rooted in apathy and fear. And now we've broken down the change through stories, you've started to tackle the fear. But what about apathy? Well, apathy is that feeling we have when something's too hard and we just don't want to do it. So if I go back to my healthier goal earlier, I know that going for a run or not eating that chocolate is rationally better for me. But exercise can sound a bit like hard work, especially on a rainy day, and beer and crisps, they just taste so good. So we might rationally know that moving to net zero is better for our health. It's better for our prosperity and the planet as well. But making those changes needed at an individual level can be too much hard work, especially if it's raining and you don't want to drive. So this is where the path comes in. We know that it's not going to be easy. We know there's going to be distractions and easier choices to make. But how do we guard against them? How do we increase the chances that our teams stay in our path? Well, we undertake our exercise with a lot of our changes in Curium called a pre-mortem, which really helps to bring those obstacles and challenges to life so we can factor them into our plans and stories above. You're probably asking what a pre-mortem is. It's a pretty simple process where we walk through the future path of a change, and at each step challenge ourselves to identify what could go wrong. And when we do this, we often find having a supportive but critical friend in the room really helps to road test it and bring things to life. We'd ask questions like, what could distract us? What would cause our resistors to resist? What's likely to stall our momentum at this point? What's going to puncture confidence that it's the right thing to do, contradict what we're trying to achieve? And ultimately, by articulating all of those blockers, we can tackle them. By doing this exercise, we can proactively remove them by adding them in to our plans and actions moving forward. It gives us a chance to remove them before they have the chance to delay or stop or change. Now, if we bring that back to life here for net zero and walking rather than driving, we'd likely identify that people may want to avoid walking in the rain. Now, unfortunately, we can't control the weather, but we might make it more convenient and accessible to use public transport. We can make them more frequent, cheaper, faster, cleaner, or, like we have done here in Birmingham, make them less convenient to use cars, like the congestion charges, or having limited or expensive parking. Now, I know this might seem daunting, and you might not know where to start, but if you've done the two things previously, you already have made a really solid start. By mapping out the change you think you want and what you want to be different, and then building upon that with the stories you've worked through with your team, you've got a really solid basis to then say what's going to stop that happening. Now, even after doing this exercise, you might identify things that are outside of our control, a bit like the rain in my example. That's normal. The next question we ask ourselves should be, but can I influence it? You'd be very surprised how often you actually can. But it's okay if you can't control or influence it. The key is that you've recognized it's a challenge. You've recognized that it's a potential obstacle that's going to maybe get in the way of your plans. So you can account for it. You can put things in place to avoid it happening in the first place. After all, forewarned is forearmed. So that's the three key steps we've talked about. And if you go to the next slide, please, Emily. As I said at the beginning, this session wasn't intended to be a silver bullet to your challenges in bringing about change with net zero, but hopefully it's given you a different perspective and some food for thought on what you could do to increase your chances of success. So remember, direct the rider with clarity, share a clear vision and map out the change, not just in what you're going to deliver, but what you want to happen as a consequence of it. Motivate the elephant, access the emotion in your teams through the use of storytelling. It's a far more compelling way to get the elephant moving in the direction you want to. And then finally, shape the path. If you use a pre-mortem to identify the blockers proactively, you have a chance of removing them before they become a problem. So if you'd like to find out more about Dan and Chip Heath and their metaphor of using the elephant and rider, I'd thoroughly recommend YouTubing it. It's free, you don't have to buy anything. It's really quite engaging. There's some brilliant short videos on there that help bring that to life. And if you'd like to find out more about how you could map the change, use storytelling or undertake pre-mortems, then please just give me a shout or head over to our website to find out more. So I think I've got a couple of minutes left. So I just wanted to open it up and see if there was any questions or thoughts on what I've shared with you guys today. If you put them in the chat, if not, we can cover them at the end.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have sort of 5-10 minutes for Q&A at the end as well. So if you have any questions that you're typing out now, then we'll definitely come back to Rob with those afterwards. Thank you ever so much, Rob. I'll now hand over to Luke Strickland, who's Net Zero Advisory Lead for Buildings and Cities at McDonalds, to do a case study on how businesses are sort of leading and managing and making this journey towards net zero. Over to you, Luke.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks, Rob and Will, for fantastic presentations so far. Haven't got any elephant references, I'm afraid. I don't know if I can weave in the Marvel universe much as I'd like to. So this might be a bit more straight, if that's okay. So as Emily said, I'm Luke Strickland. I'm the Net Zero Advisory Lead at McDonald's. So I've spent the last 20 years in multidisciplinary engineering consultancy, both as a chartered engineer and as a chartered environmentalist. And really, over the last decade, I've seen my role differently. I've started to frame that a bit differently. And really, these days, I feel like my role is to make environmental and sustainability issues, particularly around net zero, more visible, to help a really wide range of people, whether they're clients, whether they're colleagues, whether they're designers, just to make better decisions. Rob's talked so eloquently about the importance of behavior change, and you could boil all of this down to let's make some better decisions in these crucial areas. So often for me in my professional life, this is in the area of the built environment and around the planning, policy and investment decisions that go with it. So that's a little bit about me. If you move on, Emily, just to introduce Mott MacDonald, and feel free just to click through those. Well done. So in case you don't know who Mott MacDonald are, oh, go back a sec. This is, Chris Whitty. You wouldn't get this with Chris Whitty, would you? So if you don't know Mott MacDonald, we are a global employee-owned engineering, management and development consultancy, and we've got a really big vision to create solutions that make a lasting difference for humanity and environment. We are second only to John Lewis in the UK in terms of employee ownership, and what that means for us is that actually we're a really values-driven organisation. And apart from the big numbers there, we are a UK-based organisation, and actually we've got a fantastic heritage here in the Midlands. So we have been part of the community here since 1919, when A.H. Waters came back from the First World War with his Victoria Cross and set up his consultancy on Colmore Row. That A.H. Waters became part of Mott, Hay and Anderson, who became part of who formed Mott MacDonald in the late 80s. And we have been here we've been on Newell Street in different buildings for over 50 years, just to say how much we're part of the furniture. And we've got over 400 staff here in the Midlands these days who are contributing to all kinds of sectors. We're really well known for our work in the transport sector locally, but actually we work across sectors, and that's a really exciting place for us to be. And I will come to that in a little bit, because the story I want to tell today is around our own journey in terms of looking at our business and what do we do, how do we change and influence that change and affect that change in our business, but then how do we start to cascade that out to the relationships with the clients and the suppliers and the sectors that we are working in. And so I'm going to come on to that a little bit later on. But where I'm going to start on our next slide is really our own carbon journey. So we have been actively reducing our carbon emissions for much of the last decade, really, in keeping with our sustainability agenda. And we've made really great progress. But in 2020, despite everything going on in 2020, we actually decided it was time to ramp up our ambitions and to go fully carbon neutral. Our original plan had been to go carbon neutral in 2022, but our executive chairman challenged us and said, let's make it happen this year. And this was in the midst of lockdowns and all of that uncertainty, but we did it. And so, we have been just recently got our certification for the second year in a row that we are fully carbon neutral, which is no mean feat actually for a really large organization that's working across a lot of countries and across a lot of sectors. And what's unique about us as well is that we own an engineering contracting business too. We've got lots of diggers and things like that. And that's our operations aren't just paper-based. It's not just about printers and how people get to the offices, although that is a huge part of that. But once we'd got to carbon neutral, the challenge is, well, what next? How do we get to net zero? So carbon neutral is just stasis from, on where you are. And actually there's a lot there about, not making things worse. And perhaps offsetting some of the things that you are doing. Our drive to net zero is about, well, how do we actually really reduce our emissions, not just keep them static, but how do we reduce them? And how do we start to influence that around our supply chain as well? And so we have set our net zero strategy, which is to get to net zero, including our contracting business by 2040. And we are underpinned by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So we've had not just our goal, but our trajectory certified by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And that's a really important element when you are thinking about changing to net zero. It's fine to have a goal in mind. They're really important. And if you read the news, if you heard anything about COP 26 at the end of last year, targets are all over the place. Okay, right? They're all over the news, and that's fantastic. Okay, so in the UK law, according to the changes to the Climate Change Act, the legally binding target is for the UK to get to net zero by 2050. Will has already mentioned the regional target set by the Combined Authority, which is to get to net zero by 2041. Those are end games. There is a Marvel reference. I did it, Rob. Those are end games, but the trajectory, the journey is really, really important. And Will's already mentioned, the deep reductions in emissions that are the ambition. In fact, the necessity this decade in terms of locally around in the Combined Authority region, a 25% reduction in regional emissions by 2026. That is a big change, and so trajectory is really, really important. So that is what we are starting to work on in terms of our net zero plan, and it covers not just our operations, but we start to see, well, how does it go beyond our walls in terms of the projects that we're involved with, which I will come on to in terms of our influence, and then the partnerships that we are in. This is getting to net zero is a community effort. I think we recognize that we are part of a community, whether that's locally here in the Midlands, whether that is the sectors that we work in. That there is a place for competition and competitiveness and peer pressure, but actually in terms of effecting system level change in the industry sectors that we work in, that is our end game, and we need to pull together a super group to do that, and that is where we're working with other partners. So if we move on to our next slide, what does some of this mean for us then? So here's what I'm talking about in terms of our journey. So we've got our target, and we have got interim targets as well. So we are measuring all the way through, and we've talked about how we've talked internally about how we are measuring some of those things, and we are reporting regularly against those targets. There's going to come a point, and this is probably going to be the same for many organizations that are trying to get to net zero, where you do have to think about offsetting, but and compensating somehow. But that is only for the tiny residue. Okay, this isn't, the difference perhaps around with carbon neutrality is that you could just buy offsetting. So don't mean to be a cynic, but Formula One have said, well, we're going to be net zero by 2030. Now, my gut feel is that possibly, given the amount of fossil fuels used in transporting things to races around the place, and I know that they are pioneering new technologies and all of that kind of stuff, I suspect offsetting might be a really big part of that. Okay, and you've got to be so, I'm prepared to be proved wrong there, but you've got to be so mindful about greenwash. So for us, this is about credible reporting, credible baselines, and credible trajectories. But we know that we can start to make more of an impact as we go beyond just our own operations and think about the impact on the projects that we work in. So, gathering good quality, accurate data is a really good starting point, whatever your organization is. And by the way, you can't win hearts and minds just with data. Okay, so all the stuff that Rob has talked about in terms of moving the elephant, that you've got to take that into account as well and bring people with you. But part of that is by giving people the facts. And starting with good quality data. So we share details of our carbon footprint openly with our employees all the way through. Okay, so we've got a Power BI dashboard, which has allowed people to drill into the data. We've been really transparent about that, but also to provide their own suggestions about how to cut our emissions. So we've kind of crowdsourced ideas, and that's something you could do in your organization as well. So some of these ideas include, we take a vegan first approach to catering for meetings and events. That's a simple thing, but it's like, well, we're just, as a default, all of our stuff's going to be vegan unless people choose otherwise. Part of that, part of the credibility as well is that independent certification. So I've talked about the science-based targets initiatives. We've actually made sure that our reporting and our goals are accredited by to the ISO standard, which is 14064. And we've also met the standard for carbon neutrality, which is past 2060 as well. And those are really important. So if you don't know where to start, there's plenty of help around, so you've got Will and the team at the Chambers, but actually there are standards already out there, rails you can use to help you get to net zero if you don't even know how to frame the question. And so for us, this wasn't about badges and medals. This was about just demonstrating that we followed the right processes and working that through so that we can better advise our clients as well. Now, if we move on to the next slide, the organizational footprint is the bit we have to report on for our past 2060 certification and for our science-based targets. And this diagram shows the kinds of things that we include in this. So you may have or not come across that these talks about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And this is really just a way of thinking about what are the areas that you can influence. Okay, so there's some things in your direct control, the scope 1, the stuff at the center of the circle there. And there's some things that are beyond your control, which might be more about your supply chains and materials and stuff that you're coming in. But these are things that we have to address, and these are criticisms that you would see in the news about, international and national declarations that don't take into account supply chains. The criticism that you might be exporting your emissions somewhere else. So, well, look, within our own patch we're fine, yeah, but all this stuff that we're transporting half around the world is coming in, and I know. So we've got to address consumption in some way. But our biggest forms of emissions for our kind of core business is around our office energy. It is around waste, it is around business travel, employee commuting, and then the goods and services that we buy. But then our contracting business, that's really different as well, because we have got heavy plant, we are digging holes, we are using materials to help build things. And that's a real challenge that we are working with. And I will come to that around, how do we decarbonize the construction industry? And what do we do with all of our infrastructure? We're proud of the way we've shaped our built environment over a long period, but we can't carry on that business as usual into the future as well. So what we're seeing is that this net zero space is really evolving. Okay, so if you've been around for a little while, for me the net zero has become a bit, or can be at worst, a bit of a buzzword. And it reminds me of the word sustainability 10 years ago, or actually environmental issues 20 years ago, where it can mean everything and nothing at the same time. And that's why actually looking at some of the standards is really, really helpful. Net zero is being used as a bit of a brand, but for us, for our values, we want to be credible but ambitious as well, and we want our commitments to be really relevant to our staff and to the areas that we are working in. So, yes, we're looking at reductions. Yes, we're looking at removals, but actually, we know that our biggest challenge is the projects that we work on, and therefore our position in the industry. And so, what I want to move on to now is how we're starting to lead the conversation in our industry and in the sectors where we have influence as well. So, if we can move on to the next slide. Some of the ways that we are helping to lead the change is, all of it is through our relationships, actually. So, this isn't about, you can't necessarily drive change from the top down. From the rider down, to use Rob's metaphor. You have to engage people and you have to use your existing relationships. And one of the things that we are fortunate to have is a wide range of deep relationships across a wide range of sectors. So we actually do feel that we can use our, we are a bit of an elephant actually in terms of the size that we are, but we can, if we can point that in the right direction, we can effect change at system level. And that is really where we're pitching. We don't want to just be scrubbing around in the weeds, because we know we've got the influence, we've got the domain knowledge and understanding of many of our built environment sectors, that we can actually effect change across the industry. And that's what we want to do. So at the core of it is around leading by example with credibility. And that's what I've talked about so far in terms of our own journey. But then it's also, we want to be working with clients who want to make a difference as well. So there are some clients and some sectors that we are not working with But there's some sectors that we are working in that you might be surprised about, but it's because the clients have said, we want to change. And of course, we're going to help people to change, but we are not going to help them to carry on with polluting business as usual practices. So we have hard decisions to make about who we are working with here, but we recognize we have a duty to help people change if they want to change. We are working with all of our existing relationships. We don't wipe the slate again and say, well, we're doing something completely different. We have got to help those people that we're working with to recognize some of the challenges that they're facing and to help articulate some of those. And part of that was why we changed our own business, because we want to say, we've wrestled with this and we can help you wrestle with this. And helping scope some of the implementation for our clients and bringing that rigor and integrity to decarbonisation. We are a technical organisation, and we've got a lot of really technical people who love process, and they love rigor, and they love detail. And actually, that is great, because we need that. We can't just be fluffy targets and fluffy rhetoric. You need that top-down target. I don't disagree with that. But the messy middle is where you actually practically implement it, and that is really where we find ourselves. So, a couple of specific ways that we are doing this, or a couple of categories. Emily, if you could move to the next slide. We've worked with writing a lot of guidance for industry and writing a lot of policy, actually. So we were involved in the infrastructure carbon review a few years ago. We've set our own net zero infrastructure policy documents that we've put out there. We helped author, and we are currently updating PAS 2080, which is the first publicly available specification on carbon management in infrastructure. That's being expanded to include built environment as well. This is a snapshot. And then actually we've done quite a bit of work with the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition, which I'll come on to. But some of the documents we've written there are looking about pathways. So the pathway to zero carbon heat was something that we authored a couple of years ago, which Will's mentioned actually about technology and technology change. We've talked, you'll find that there's been a lot of focus around the energy sector on energy generation and electricity, but heat is a huge element of that as well. And there are pathways that we don't quite know yet, because the technology is still still emerging. So is it a fully electrified pathway to heat? Is it, what role does hydrogen play? And what are some of the pathways in between? And so exploring some of that uncertainty is how we've been helping to contribute and lead the industry as well, to say, to set that vision. Actually, as Rob talked about, you've got to set a credible vision. And we said, well, the future could look like this. So we've been exploring futures actually in a lot of this stuff, but how they apply in specific sectors and with specific client types, and also crucially to specific parts of the country, because we know that actually, you need to make regional decisions that fit the baseline of the area that you are working in. For example, in the Midlands, we know that there are more kind of high carbon intense jobs than in other parts of the country, and we need to recognise that with the decisions that we make. So part of the way that we're doing it is by leading a conversation, setting and exploring credible future visions, and engaging in the conversation. And then the second broad point, really, if we move on to the next slide, is really about doing this with other people and forming coalitions and partnerships. So a really good example of this is the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition. So we formed this a few years ago, which is a mixture of central government, local government, academia, the private sector, consultancy, contracting. And we, with this coalition, this is not something that brings revenue. This is about pooling knowledge across the industry, and with decision makers to work out how can we make a way forward. So we talked about the path to zero carbon heat, something that I was involved in last year, that I didn't manage to put onto a slide, I'm afraid, where it was a report called A Place-Based Approach to Net Zero, which you could Google and find. But that was all exploring about the role that cities and city regions have in accelerating the transition to net zero, because you can't just have a top-down approach, and you've got the powers at city level to convene and aggregate solutions and all of that kind of stuff. And this isn't the only kind of organization and partnership that we're involved in. We joined Race to Zero. We're part of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. There's all of these kinds of things, and whatever sector you are working in, whatever scale you are at, there are coalitions and partnerships to be involved in. So in terms of managing and leading the change, you know, none of us are doing this on our own. And actually, this is definitely a group effort, and we can go further together. So that's really important when we're thinking about the targets that we're setting and the ways to do it. You know, there is no one size fits all approach, and we have to share good practice. And that is what some of the things that we have been doing through these coalitions. So as I come into land, just want to, this is my call to action slide, the final slide. What can you do? You know, we can feel powerless at times in the face of, you know, for example, another IPCC report that's come out this week that is painting a bleak picture, let alone off the back of, you know, a major global pandemic, wars around the world, that kind of stuff. We can feel powerless, but Rob's already said we have got far more influence than we can sometimes realize. So here's what you can do about it, both as an individual and in whatever role that you have. Firstly, you know, you can demand it. Your voice is really important, whether that is as a citizen, whether that is as a consumer, whether that's as an employee. Some of our best solutions have come, you know, for practical change in our organization, have come from our employees, you know, saying we've got to do better, right? We've recognized that voice, and that's really important. And you can think about some of the big flips. So single-use plastic, you know, that was consumer driven. Shock, like flipping it, we need to do something about this, right? The power of your voice is really important. So you can demand it, whatever position you are in, whatever spheres you have influence in, you can demand it. You can drive it as well. So if you are a client of any kind, you can set this in your tenders, right? You can set this as a condition in the things that you are bidding for. You can set it for your suppliers. You can drive it and model it. We don't have to just go with business as usual anymore. Okay, so you can drive change by just asking it. And actually, some great examples of this kind of stuff is in the news this week. You know, Tesco saying, well, actually, we're not going to accept wet wipes as they always have been anymore, and that's just not good enough. You know, that is a great example of change being driven down from the top. So you can drive it by the power of your purchasing, but also by your policies and by your standards and by your entry requirements for work that you are tendering, for example. And thirdly, you can model it. You know, we have to be realistic here, and you know, on the projects that you're working in your company processes and policies, you can start to model this. And you know, sometimes our actions speak louder than our words. Okay, so you can start to make a difference anyway. But finally, you know, we've got to move it. We've got to move it. Okay, we are in the face of a climate emergency. You know, all these climate emergencies were declared, you know, even regionally in 2019. We're now in 2022. We are still facing stark warnings about change. You know, we're starting to experience the effects of extreme weather. We have got to make this decade a decade of change, and that can feel scary, but actually it is still feasible to make the change. We know what many of the solutions are, but we just need to mobilize that elephant. So I hope that's helped in terms of just sharing some of our story about how we've approached it as an organization, how we are using our relationships and our position to effect change. And I will hand back to Emily and Will for some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Luke. It was fantastic to just hear about everything you're doing about McDonald's and the kind of the big and the small in terms of, you know, tendering and modeling change and the sort of smaller things. I love the idea of vegan first catering. I think that's so practical and kind of such a small thing that's quite easily implemented in businesses. We had a question in the chat from Carolyn. Apologies, Carolyn, I couldn't see your second name. But are clients and shareholders of businesses that you work with, Rob and Luke, being increasingly conscious about net zero and demanding change?
Do you want to go first, Luke, and I'll go second?
I was going to say the other way around, but I'll happily go first. Yes, they are. And I think the trajectory is only that is going to be increasingly more of that. So I think that this idea of corporate citizenship, there's some really fantastic articles out there that you could read, but this idea that it's not good enough anymore for businesses just to make money, they need to do good as well. I think that is really rising up. And so part of the way that manifests it is through the kind of the ESG agenda, the environment and social governance of organizations. we are starting to see it from our clients where they're saying, well, we want these standards, we want to see this, we will only work with you if this. It's not just net zero as well, I think it's around, social responsibility too. So we are definitely seeing that there is work that we would be precluded from if we weren't doing it, or in fact, we're seeing even our kind of business as usual sectors. I don't know, structural engineering, mechanical and electrical engineering, tenders that are coming out are saying we are expecting this to be net zero. How are you going to address net zero in this? So it is. We are seeing it coming out there. Is it being driven by clients and shareholders? Absolutely. I think there's. People are investing their money really carefully, and you just see a lot of the divestments that's going on from fossil fuels, from pension funds, for example. So that's already an evidence of that. But I think that's going to go even further as people realise the power of their investments, but also the power of their buying, their buying power, whether that's as consumers on the ground or as shareholders.
I think to add to that, definitely seeing what Luke's seeing, but I think also a number of the clients that we're working with see the opportunity within this space, that there's innovation and ways that they can actually make money for the cynical amongst us from driving towards net zero, whether that is providing enhancements to their current products or actually brand new products. And we go through, so working with a water business at the moment, a large proportion of their new revenue of late has been around moving towards far more sustainable ways of packaging and selling their water solutions to their clients. So there's definitely opportunities there to be gained from those that are on the cutting edge of technology.
And I think just to round that off, it will increasingly be business as usual. And so if organizations are not addressing these issues, then actually they're going to lose position in the market. And so, in terms of motivating the elephant, that is a big motivator to say, well, even if you don't believe in all of this, you're going to lose market position if you don't do this and make that business as usual.
Exactly, and I think that's coming from the demand that Luke was talking about, that the consumers are, and we need to maintain to do that as consumers, driving towards net zero ourselves and taking those actions. And I think in the last couple of years, and probably for the next few, there will be competitive advantage, like you said, Luke, but I completely agree. It'll be a competitive response, not too far in the future, so long as we keep demanding the change that we're expecting.
Yeah, I'd just like to quickly add to that. Sorry, Em. I think for a lot of smaller businesses as well, it's we recognise that it can be difficult to start, but it's just about making those small changes. But also for your consumers, I mean, things like making environmentally friendly options the default, like Luke said, with vegan catering for events and within the organization, but also when they're coming to your website, where are you positioning environmental information? Is it the first thing they see when you're or getting people to your event? Are you giving them the options first that are more environmental? So it's all of these little things that can actually influence the behavior and choices that we make more broadly as well for the consumer.
Definitely. I'm conscious of time. We've got 2 minutes left, and Robin has put a question in the chat for each of you, Luke and Rob. For Luke, how many man hours do you think it took to transition your organisation to net zero?
Oh, really, really hard to say. An awful lot. And actually, Will mentioned about the barriers to this are about lack of time. We have just had to front up and say we're going to create a team to do this because we see this as an investment. So I'm not sure we've measured. I don't think we necessarily want to know the answer. It's been an awful lot, but we recognise that was needed, and we just had to invest. Part of that was through creating a central team to do it, rather than just expecting staff to do it as business as usual. So we saw it as an investment, and we planned for it that way.
Fantastic. And Rob, what's your favourite elevator pitch, kind of one-liner to initiate a change attitude of an elephant?
It's not a statement, it's normally a question. So it obviously depends on where the elephant is. But for example, if somebody was showing resistance, and resistance isn't always active, guys. Somebody sat quiet in the corner might be silently resisting you and you don't know. So it's not just the person who shouts the loudest and gives you the most grief when you're going through your sessions, but normally we just ask questions, and the questions normally would be, can you help me understand your perspective? Can you help me gain an insight into how you're feeling and going through that? It's all about not being argumentative and across the table from each other, but actually sitting side by side, no matter what part of the organization individuals in, whether the CEO or somebody who's on the front line, just asking them their opinion. The reason you do that is people like to talk about themselves. And they normally, if you just ask a couple of open questions, will give you far more insight and information than you ever thought. So how many times have you been in sessions where someone's being grumpy and actually go, oh, they're just being grumpy? Well, we attack the behavior rather than going behind it and well, what's driving that? What's that mean? So it's not necessarily an elevator pitch, Robin, but asking those open questions and trying to gain that bit of insight from their perspective normally helps. And then you can help put your arm around their shoulder and drive them in the direction that you want them to go in. But yeah, that's how I would do it.
Fantastic, thank you ever so much. I've spotted a few other questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and I'll share those with our speakers after the event. If you have a chance to give some responses, that'd be fantastic. Thank you both ever so much. I'm going to reshare my screen. And thank you for everyone who's joined us this morning for this webinar on leading and managing the transition to net zero. So a huge thank you to Will, Rob and Luke for joining us, and a massive thank you to all of our headline partners and sponsors, Aston University, Birmingham City Council, Southern City College Birmingham and the West Midlands Combined Authority. We have some fantastic events coming up, events and webinars coming up throughout Growth Through People throughout March. The next two this next week on the 9th of March and the 11th of March are on cultivating your employer brand and engaging flexible working teams. And I'm sure that the sort of transition to net zero and having that social purpose that we've talked about throughout this webinar will be a big part of both. And we also have our Growth Through People conference on the 30th of March. And we've just confirmed our first keynote speaker, which will be Ian Reid, Chief Executive Officer of Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games. We have some fantastic speakers lined up for the whole day, including Carl George, Justin Varney, and Lisa Powney from Curium Solutions, Rob's colleague. And like I said at the beginning, if you can spare 5 minutes to complete our post-event survey, which will be sent to you via email following this webinar, it'd be hugely appreciated to help inform our policy work in this area. So thank you again to all of those who have joined us today, and I hope you enjoyed the session and will take away some positive ideas to influence change within your business.